At the head of this chapter, Pincoffs gives several brief quotations that illustrate what he calls quandary ethics. The first of these is from Stephen Toulmin, the only person in the list I've actually met. When I was doing my doctoral work in Pasadena, California, he was on faculty down the road at USC. My main professor, Nancy Murphy, had written a book on reasoning that applied Toulmin's work on the subject to a particular discipline. She invited him to join her and some of her students for dinner one night. Toulmin had been a student of Ludwig Wittgenstein. That may not mean anything to you now, but when you go deeper into your study of philosophy, you'll run into him. Pincoff sets out his understanding of the dominant view of ethics right at the beginning of the chapter. He writes, "There is a consensus concerning the subject matter of ethics, so general that it would be tedious to document it. It is that the business of ethics is with problems, that is, situations in which it is difficult to know what one should do. That the ultimate beneficiary of ethical analysis is the person who, in one of these situations, seeks rational ground for the decision he must make. That ethics is therefore primarily concerned to find such grounds, often conceived of as moral rules, and the principles from which they can be derived. And that metaethics, that is, thinking about ethics, consists in the analysis of the disputation context." The first word to notice is consensus. Pincoff sees a broad agreement in the discipline that this is the proper way to frame the nature of the discipline. The quandaries he'll be examining are also variously called problems or situations. In these situations, one needs to figure out what to do. Ethical work calls for analysis of the quandary of the situation and application of a general theory, principle, or set of rules to indicate the proper course of action. Continuing at the bottom of page 14, Pincoff says that this now standard way of conceiving the nature of ethics is itself a newcomer, a recent invention. He says Plato, Aristotle, the Epicureans, the Stoics, Augustine, Aquinas, Shaftesbury, Hume, and Hegel do not conceive of ethics as the quandarists do. They were, by and large, not so much concerned with problematic situations as with moral enlightenment, education, and the good for humans. As you might expect, Pincoff zeroes in on Aristotle, whom he describes as thinking of ethics as a branch of politics, which in turn he thought of as a very wide-ranging subject having to do generally with the planning of human life so that it could be lived as well as possible. After a brief digression into the point of Aristotle's politics, Pincoff continues, "In ethics, the leading question concerns the best kind of individual life and the qualities of character exhibited by the person who leads it." Perhaps you can hear the contrast here. Quandarists are looking at isolated quandaries, perplexing, problematic situations, wherein they need to discern the correct action. The other way of conceiving ethics, the way Pincoff identifies with the larger philosophical tradition, asks instead about producing ethical people who have an increasingly clear and better understanding of what the good life is about and what kind of people they need to be to live such a life. Perhaps this way of putting Pincoff's position sounds familiar. Hint, hint. For Pincoff, a proper understanding of what we're doing in ethics is not just a question of what we're dealing with, but who we are. He writes, "The we in question is not a mere placeholder. Rather, it refers to those of us who were well brought up, who have had some experience of life, who know something of the way in which the social order operates, who have some control over the direction of our lives, in that we are capable of living according to a pattern and are not washed about by emotional tides or pulled thither and yon by capricious whim." Those that Pincoff refers to as quandarists, those who form the mainstream of ethical theorists at the time of his writing, don't just imagine that ethics is a matter of dealing with quandaries, but that who is dealing with these quandaries is the wrong question. For Pincoff, to the contrary, it is precisely a question that must be asked. First, who we are. What kind of person we are determines what kind of situation we find ourselves in. Second, it is our character that makes us the kind of person who can or cannot handle situations well. Our character may be such that we are completely blinded to considerations that choosing the good or performing in the way most conducive to producing the good require. We'll see throughout this chapter that what we're considering, matters. If atomistic individualism were true, if the best accounts of philosophical anthropology were that we were autonomous individuals, essentially interchangeable with each other, we could ignore this situation. Pincoffs isn't an individualist of that sort. On page 16, Pinkoff says, people can be perplexed because they're sensitive and conscientious, because they do not have the sense to avoid perplexity, or because they are pathologically immobilized by moral questions. A well-founded ethics would encourage the development of moral sensitivity, but would discourage the entertainment of moral quandaries that arise out of moral ineptness or pathological fixation. Quandary ethics looks for quandaries, for situations in which people are perplexed and don't automatically know what to do. The implicit assumption is that what makes a situation perplexing is a feature of the situation itself. Pincoffs is challenging that assumption. He recognizes that different kinds of people find different situations perplexing. He notes a few details of the person involved that make a difference. First, some people are aware of the kinds of situations that are likely to lead to perplexity. Being the kind of person who would prefer to be perplexed, they recognize situations for what they are and try to conduct their lives in such a way as to jump into them if they like perplexity, or avoid them if they want to avoid perplexity. Second, some people are pathologically immobilized by moral questions. These are the people who are perplexed by situations that others wouldn't think twice about. We can't say immediately that such a character is a good thing or a bad thing. It might be that some people have become desensitized to societal defects, and the person in the minority who is not blind to those defects might find himself perplexed, paralyzed by the perplexity of discerning the right course of action in such society. I think of some people in the slave states of pre-Civil War America. They were immersed in cultural propaganda that not only told them that treating one class of people like property was legitimate, but that it was a blessing to the enslaved and to the slavers. To stand against one's own society is difficult, if not impossible. In such cases, people who saw the evils of slavery would, by the norms of slave state society, be pathologically immobilized by moral questions. Discerning whether a society is morally healthy is difficult work and beyond the bounds of this course. It is a work that is of great value, however. There's a third condition Pincoffs mentions: moral ineptness. Pincoffs' assumption is that in our programs of moral education, we can become better not merely at working through moral perplexities, but at diffusing them altogether. As with the prior problem, this likely will require difficult work, especially given the moral conflict inherent in our current culture. Moving on to page 21, we find Pincoffs delving further into the differences between moral agents. For the quandarist, he says, what is relevant must have nothing to do with me, but only with the situation, a situation in which anyone could find himself. What is right for me must be right for anyone. Here we see again the assumption that people are interchangeable. Everyone is potentially anyone. Pincoffs is challenging exactly this assumption. Morality, they assume, is about doing what is right. Sure, that makes sense. When I ask students for a definition of ethics, they often tell me that it's the discipline that investigates what is right and wrong, or something along those lines. Ethics does deal with that, but it's not so simple. It's not easily reduced to the formulas modern ethical theories so often prefer to give us. While it is often the case that what is right for me is also right for anyone, there are some things that are right for me, but not right for at least some others. Similarly, there are some things that are not right for me that are perfectly fine for at least some others. Cannot tell in advance which way these things will go, apart from giving our attention to who we're talking about. There's another level of analysis that's relevant here, not mentioned by Pincoffs. We also have to pay attention to the level of description of the situation. Most situations happen within networks of relationship. And when we give our attention to where people fit in those networks, their roles in those networks, and their relationships with others, situations occurring therein can be differently and variously described. The example I see Pincoffs giving on pages 22 and 23 looks like a great idea for a discussion board post or an essay assignment. There we find him saying, and you'll notice a word repeated over and over again here, suppose that I have devoted my life to the cause of desegregation, that all of my spare time and energy and means are devoted to it. Suppose that I have taken a particular interest in the development of school policy in my town. Suppose that it is a part both of my self-conception and of the conception that others have of me, that I could not miss an opportunity to press the cause of desegregation, that if I did so, I would have to question my own integrity as a person. Suppose that I know that this particular meeting of the school board is a crucial one at which the final decision on a plan will be made. Suppose that I am recognized as the chief spokesman for the cause of meaningful desegregation. Suppose that I have built a deserved reputation with others and with myself for persistence and courage in the face of obstacles, for being a man of principle, for sensitivity to the needs of others. Then what would be right for someone else in a situation in which a solemnly given promise conflicts with an agreement to attend a meeting? Suppose that I have devoted my life to the cause of desegregation, that all my spare time, energy, and means are devoted to it. Suppose that I've, okay, let's pause right there. I've reduplicated it right there. Okay. Look at all those suppositions. Do you see what he's doing there? He's giving a thick description of a particular person situated in a particular place and time. This person has a history. This person desires to be a kind of person with a particular set of character qualities and aspirations. I bet you can imagine yourself to be a person describable in a way similar to the way Pincoffs describes this person. You have a set of commitments. There are values you hold dear and will not compromise on. There may be other values that you found convenient or perhaps have never yet had need to question, that when pressed, you may feel free to set aside. So you can hold on to other values and commitments you count more central to your identity and to your mission in life. Insofar as we intend to be moral agents, investigating the nature of the good life and aiming to achieve it, considering the suppositions that describe us is worth considering a project not just when we find ourselves in an ethics class, but throughout the course of our lives. Pincoffs sums up this section further down on page 23. Given this understanding, ethics must take seriously the formation of character and the role of personal ideals. And these matters must be discussed at length before decision-making is discussed. Moral decision-making will no longer appear in the literature as an exercise in a special world of reasoning by agents of undefined character. I'm sure you're noticing something else here. When we find ourselves in perplexity, wondering how to act in whatever current situation we face, we will not usually have time then to begin the process of considering the formation of character and our personal ideals. If we are to be the kind of person, the kind of people who live well, we will need to give thought to these things from here on out. Consider what Pinkoff says in the paragraph spanning pages 24 and 25. He looks at two ways a rule may come to bear on an agent. His point is that some rules function as commands, some as orders. Drawing this metaphor from the sphere of military operations, the former operates much more specifically than the latter. Orders set up the general framework and goals in view. Commands require exact steps to be taken precisely. On page 25, Pincoffs observes, some moral rules are more like general standing orders than like general standing commands. For example, love thy neighbor or do not cause suffering. They say what is wanted, but do not say what to do. Do you see the generality here? There are innumerable ways to love one's neighbor, innumerable ways in which suffering can be caused, ways that we should eschew. There are too many in each case for us to list. The nature of our character will shape our understanding of these rules and provide ways in which we can fulfill them. Bringing moral education into the picture, we will seek to develop the kind of character that has an increasingly clear understanding of what constitutes love of neighbor and causing suffering. We will learn to recognize cases in which there is a conflict of interpretation on these matters. Say when someone says, if you really love me, you will do whatever I want you to do. Or, it would cause me great suffering if you were to require me to write this paper. At the bottom of page 26, we see a couple of terms that are worth knowing: obligation and supererogation. An obligation is something we are supposed to do, something expected of us. Supererogation is doing more than what is expected of us. If you ever take a course in the history of the Protestant Reformation or in Catholic theology, you'll run into this second term. Luther and other Protestants looked askance at the idea of a treasury of merits generated by saints who went above and beyond what was required. These merits produced by the supererogation of the saints could then be passed on to the rest of us who fell short of what was required to get in with God. That's not the use Pincoffs is making of this term. He says a person's character is likely to exhibit itself in his making obligatory for himself what he would not hold others obligated to do. A person does not attain moral status by what he demands of others, but by what he demands of himself. We each live in moral communities in which shared expectations, rights, duties, and responsibilities. What I require of myself may look like supererogation to others, while I take it to be just part of my normal life. Quandary ethics, on Pincoff's account, doesn't allow for these differences between what we expect of ourselves and what we expect of others. What counts as a quandary, a perplexing situation, will vary from person to person, depending not only on one's moral community, but also where one stands in that community and what expectations one has for oneself. On page 30, Pincoffs turns to explicit consideration of moral education. He writes, the problem of moral education is not so much teaching children how to make moral decisions as giving them the background out of which arise the demands that decisions be made. The focus of moral education might well be not so much decisions as the inculcation of excellences of character. The adult of good moral character must indeed be able to handle difficult situations as they arise and to reason about problems unforeseeable by his parents. But to reason well, he must already be an adult of good moral character, loyal, just, honest, sensitive to suffering, and the rest. Everything is not up for grabs. Unless he has these qualities, moral dilemmas will not arise for him. Unless he has a well-formed character, his prescriptions for himself and others are not likely to be morally acceptable. One aim of moral education that the quandarists are apt to overlook is the development of the sense of the moral self as the product of continuous cultivation. It is as a formed and still forming self that one either confronts or properly avoids moral problems. There are no moral problems for the child whose character is yet to be formed. What do you think of this account of the background required for moral education? If Pincoffs is correct, the background required for other ethical theories, the theories that manifest in what he calls quandary ethics, is usually ignored or even denied. By this time in the course, you've had at least a superficial overview of some of these theories: Kantianism, utilitarianism, and egoism. What would moral education look like in these traditions? How would it be more than mere identification of relevant rules and sharpening application of those rules to situations? There's one more point I'd like to draw from what Pinkoff says here. He said one aim of moral education is the development of the sense of the moral self as the product of continuous cultivation. Having a required course in ethics has been common in recent years. Sometimes the thought is something like, our society needs moral people. Courses in ethics will produce moral people. You know from what I said in the beginning of this course that I'm highly skeptical of this claim. I do think courses in ethics can help us be more moral. There is no bypassing, however, the necessity that being moral, that achieving the good life is something that requires continuous cultivation of ourselves well beyond the confines of a single course or even a set of courses. This cultivation may take place as the product of an individual, but is more commonly associated with our participation in moral communities. What moral communities do you see in your vicinity that are working well to cultivate moral character? How can we differentiate and assess the aims and performance of these communities? To what degree, if any, are we free to choose between them for ourselves?